also too, I've kind of prepared a couple of different resources for you that go along with this. I use a system called Wakelet. Just show of hands, does anyone here use Wakelet? Wakelet's this. It's a great thing to use with students because it's kind of like Pinterest. You can curate anything on the web, and it has like it's secure, unlike Pinterest, which is loose to the world. Wakelet, you can just kind of let your students or a group of students actually see these resources. You can use it for a lot of different things, but that's what I use it for. And that link will take you to a Wakelet where I've shared some of the resources that I used to create this presentation. And if you open it and copy it, it's there for I think for eternity, actually. I don't know. It won't go away till I throw it away, which won't be for quite a long time. And I also created a Padlet here that we can use to use for discussion, either before or after the session. If you post a question up there, I can actually answer it. But you're also free to answer other people's, or have your own conversation within that space. Okay, first question. Have a little think, and theoretically on this side you should see a link to a Mentimeter board, and that Mentimeter board, I will create a word cloud. So I thought that would be a good way to get information from people, providing it works like it's supposed to. And just have a little think to this question: why do we plan? And maybe just add three words. Three words. Why do you think teachers have to plan? Obviously, there's like probably a lot of words that could go with that. So words I've seen come up so far. Oh, well, I'm getting quite a few words there, which is good. So we've got like transparency, preparation, organization. Oh, this is an excellent word. I haven't even thought of that word before, but it's a fantastic word. Intentionality. Whoa, that's a brilliant word, and a really good way to describe planning, right? Intentionality. This is what I hope to accomplish by creating this unit. Improvise, plan to replan. Excellent. Plan to replan, as every teacher knows. Just like this morning when Yanan and I opened up the session, we had to do some replanning, right? It's kind of a constant thing, especially if you work with technology. Understanding, because my boss said so, classroom management, reach the intended unit, improvise our plan, understand knowledge. Wow, reflect on our teaching. Those are all excellent words adding to that. Right, but I think that one word that I think is kind of important with planning, and as an IB teacher, IB is a little bit unique in that quite often our planning documents are shared with the parents and the actual students, which doesn't always happen in every system, but it's kind of an interesting thing because it's showing everybody, it's being transparent about that intention, as you mentioned before. Okay. Oh, I'm just gonna. Can I get out of this now? One sec. There we go. Okay. Brilliant. Those are all excellent reasons why we plan. I think, and you should be able to see the Mentimeter show up on the side if you're logged in now, right? Now the big thing in the work that I've done in Asia Pacific, because I've worked with a lot of Chinese, Indian, Indonesian, Saudi Arabian schools, where national schools or pretty traditional schools have taken on IB programs with their original set of teachers. And one of the things that I've discovered is that a lot of teacher training programs teach teachers to deliver curriculums, but they don't actually cover curricular design. And the jump from delivering a curriculum to designing a curriculum is a really big jump, and it involves some PD. And I just thought another one here about unit planning versus um, what do you think? What do you think are the big differences? And that's another Mentimeter. that you should be able to add to. If I just have to pull it up here. There we go. And I'll put it up on the screen and hit the present button again. Let's see what we got. Unit planning versus big picture. That's an excellent idea about big picture. Unit plans, lesson plans are discrete things, right? They're kind of like set in specific time frames. They kind of usually deal with like one or two objectives at a time. Does anybody else have something they want to put up there for differences between unit versus lesson planning? Contextual concepts, yeah, usually. I like this, how this pops up like this. This is quite cool. Yeah, definitely. Unit planners are usually a longer duration, long versus short, concepts, whole versus part. That's an excellent thing. Unit plans, especially as an administrator, unit plans are a really kind of bird's eye view thing. We can kind of get a big feel for what's happening in that class, rather than looking at lesson plans. It's kind of in little tiny bits. Lesson plans deal with all the minutes. Yeah, they're kind of mostly due to time, mostly for time planning. There's moving too fast. Trying to follow it on the screen. It's like watching mice. Let's see, includes experiences. Usually unit plans are quite often, they can be based on different things. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But they usually have either a conceptual focus or a project focus, or they're usually much bigger things, right? Let's see what else we got. Detailed, time spent, connection. Good point too about connections, right? Lessons should be connected, but they don't necessarily have to be. And also too, I think an outside looker might not actually see the connections if they just saw a pile of lesson plans, right? What else have we got? Big ideas, conceptual. Good, excellent. Thank you for those contributions. Lessons are more detailed. Yeah, they do tend to be. But just a show of hands, how many of you in this group actually still do detailed lesson plans every day? Hands up if you do. Now a couple people. Now question: How many people work at a school where they have to hand in lesson plans? Where they actually have to hand in an administrator lesson plan? Quite a few. Yeah. And that's an interesting thing, right? Because that's when you're making teachers hand in daily lesson plans, it's kind of almost like you don't trust. I mean, daily lesson plans are a good thing, obviously, because they are organization and they do give some accountability. But making people hand in their lesson plans every week, I think that's mostly an accountability thing, or it's a surveillance thing, right? And if in the IB planners, the official IB planners, there is no kind of place for, we have something called a learning plan, right, where you kind of outline the learning engagements that you're going to do, but there's no requirement for actual daily lesson plans. And the reason why they move away from that is because when you're doing more sophisticated things like inquiry or like project-based learning, you can't actually say from 9 to 9:50, this is going to happen. Right? So it would be pretty much impossible in a PYP, in a primary classroom, to guarantee that between 9 and 9:50, these kids are going to learn X, right? It just doesn't work that way, right? Different people learn at different speeds. So it's a kind of interesting thing. But lesson planning is something that's taught in most teacher training programs. Unit planning, as I've found out, because right now I'm working, my program is international students right now. So I have students from India, Taiwan, Korea, Hong Kong, Canada, and the US, and Japan. And I was surprised because I would have thought that most of them would have been unit planning in their classrooms. But if they don't have a requirement to plan units, they usually work off chapters, right? So if they're working from a textbook, they work off a chapter. So the lesson plan says which part of the chapter you're going to do each week, but it doesn't actually, the chapter is created by a publisher, so the teacher isn't actually designing the chapter, right? They're just kind of going through it. So that's I think, one of the big things about between unit planning and lesson planning. That's an unfortunate reality. Lesson planning, and I'll just throw this out. That should have showed the Mentimeter, the final one up there. Okay, and I've kind of been talking about this already. While most teachers are familiar with lesson plan, many may not be familiar with unit plannings, and this is especially true of people that have come out of systems that are very textbook orientated. Like here in Japan, the government dictates which textbook you use. You can't deviate from the textbook, basically. That's what the kind of government thing. I think the same in some other countries, right? Just a sec. In terms of responses we got back here. So I've always planned units. I'm new to unit planning. I've always planned units. Okay, so a lot of you guys do, but that could also be because of the audience we're talking to. You guys have already signed up for kind of workshops all over the place. So obviously you're reflective teachers looking to improve your practice. You probably have colleagues that have been doing the same thing they've been doing in the classroom next door for the last 30 years. They're not particularly interested in making radical changes to their practice, right? I mean, not just because you're a teacher doesn't mean you're necessarily a reflective teacher looking to improve your practice. I mean, everybody's doing it for the right reasons, but okay. So just talk about the components of a lesson plan. We kind of came up in the comments, you guys. There's definitely a set time frame. There's usually limited objectives, some form of a learning plan, which may or may not be divided into phases, right? And usually there's some reference to what kind of resources you're going to be using. And unit plans come in various different formats. It depends what kind of tradition you come from. I've been working in IB schools for the last 20 years. So one great thing about the IB community is that the whole community shares common planning formats. And so it doesn't matter if you're in a school in Egypt, or you're a school in Fiji, or you're in a school in Canada, you can look at that planner and you already know what they're, because it's the same format, we can interpret them and kind of figure out what the teacher's after. But I work at a university that has a primary school that isn't an IB school, and I did some work with their teachers a month or two ago, and they didn't share a common planning format. So amongst the different teachers, every teacher just kind of planned and when you sat down to have conversations about teaching and learning, it was really difficult because they weren't using the same language. They could talk about it, but it wasn't as easy as if you had a group of IB teachers and you brought up like, what's your central idea or what's your inquiry statement? Everybody knows what that is, so we can kind of jump into big conversations about it. But it's surprising how many schools don't have a common planning format. And these unit plans can take on different ilks, right? Project-based units, thematic-based units, conceptual units, inquiry units, problem-based units, or in the case of the IB and maybe some other places, there's integrative or interdisciplinary units. Most of them span a couple of weeks to a term or possibly even a semester, depending on the kind of nature of the school. Oh, sorry, I haven't one. Right, and also too, I wanted to just kind of talk about this idea about there's mentioned it before, but a huge difference between delivering a curriculum and designing a curriculum. Delivering is a kind of lower end kind of. It's very important and people can be very gifted at it, but it just basically, when you're planning for a set curriculum that you're just delivering, usually you're kind of planning when you're going to do chunks of it here and there, but it's kind of a reorganization kind of a type of planning, right? And it doesn't always require unit plans because sometimes the units have already been, or chapters or whatever, have already been built for you, which is a little different than designing curriculums. And this is kind of, as you move to more progressive pedagogies, this becomes much more important. So somebody, Pete, I think, has already typed an answer here. He said, my training focused on delivering to be and then I can't read what it was. I think I did both. Okay. I think I did both. Oh, that's good. Well, that's good to hear. But designing curriculum is a much higher level kind of thing, because it's not just reorganizing the curriculum, it's sometimes adding and making it more and better, right? Teachers have made connections between groups of objectives and content, right? So for example, you may be taking a piece of the math curriculum and a piece of the science curriculum and combining them together, right, in a unique manner. Usually they're focused on concepts and context, not just content. You have to make appropriate decisions with regard to allocating instructional time, and make informed decisions about the type of flexible, big spelling mistake resources that you use. So we're just looking at the responses here. I can show the responses actually, so people should be able to see this. But I'm not, just a sec. I show the responses here, right? Sorry. I'm just going to go back to here. As you can see the responses, because you're looking at my teacher screen. If you're looking at my teacher screen, you can see them. Okay. Components of a unit plan, time frames bigger. There's usually some form of learning plan, which could take the form of individual lessons. So in schools that require individual lesson planning, they could ask you to hand in X number of lessons. And if anybody here is a PYP teacher and used the old PYP planner, right, it didn't have a box big enough for those lessons. So sometimes they went on for pages and pages and pages after it, because the school required them to give lesson plans. Depending on and then the focus of a unit plan sort of depends on whether your school, which approach to planning your school's taken, right? So if it's an IB school, the IB's told you the approach to be taken. But if you're not an IB school, then the school itself has to decide which approach it's going to take, right? So lots of schools take problem-based learning approach, right? And it's interesting that if schools have taken an inquiry approach, they're usually going to be dependent. They usually choose a specific inquiry cycle, and then their unit planner would sort of describe the sections of that cycle. So the inquiry cycle kind of determines the nature of the unit plan. Okay, we're going to just move on to talk about the kind of the couple of different approaches. The first one I want to talk about is the conceptual-based curriculum. Just a show of hands on your Zoom thing. I've read, and I like this because sometimes one of the questions is I've read the work or I know about it, because there's a big difference between seeing the book in the staff room and actually having read the book. The great thing about Erickson's books, Lynn Erickson, she's quite old now, and I don't think she's out and about as much as she used to be. But Erickson is kind of the guru of the conceptual-based curriculum. I don't know if she was the first person to think it up, but she's definitely one of the first people to have been writing extensively about it, and one of the first people that kind of made it down to the school level. And she trains trainers to teach about conceptually based curriculums. She doesn't have a specific planner. There isn't, like, if your school subscribes to an Erickson version of conceptual understanding, there's no kind of external force that's imposing rules on it. So schools can take and shape it to fit their particular context as they like to. So there's no one Lynn Erickson planner, but there are several that have been adapted and used by different people. And I'm going to take you through a couple that I've run across. I know this may be too small to read, but this basically, this one here, she talks about concepts that are at the top, vocabulary. I'm not sure why that's there, but it's a good thing to have there. generalizations, guiding questions, summative tasks, assessment strategies and tools, knowledge, skills, learning engagements, and formative assessments, and down at the bottom, resources. So that's one version of an Erickson planner that I've seen in different places. This one here, this one kind of sums up the main kind of features in a conceptual planner. So definitely and this first little box I really like at the top. And I think this is something that's missing from IB planners, is that the first box is talking about what is the purpose of this unit, to get the teachers to actually describe what they want to accomplish in this unit. And I think that's a really important field, because if you don't give teachers that field, then they try to stick it in other places, which may not be appropriate. Right? And there's definitely a spot for conceptual focus, key and related concepts. Sometimes she calls them macro and micro concepts. Enduring understanding. So this is an Erickson word. Essential questions. Then the content, right? Whatever the curricular content is. The skills that you hope to instill or teach or develop in students. And this version of the planner has a performance assessment. Probably, I'm sure some of you have also looked at, we'll talk about it in a sec, the UBD planning. And I think this performance assessment, that actually comes from the UBD tradition, right? Learning activities. I personally have a big problem with the word activity. I think that that activity, and in the IB community, we moved away from the word activity and we use the word learning engagement. And learning engagement to me is a much better word, because activity doesn't imply any learning. Activity means kind of doing something, but it doesn't necessarily mean learning. Learning engagement says that you're doing some kind of activity that's going to incur learning. It's a kind of a semantic thing, but I think it's quite important. And resources and teacher notes and reflections. So this was a kind of a little bit of a different spin on it. And then, right, next version the next one I want to look at is understanding by design. Oh, really? This is interesting. So if some of the comments are coming up, this is new to me. So learning by design was developed by an approach to planning, which has now expanded to, now they're kind of into school administration and all sorts of stuff. But originally it was pretty simply an approach to planning developed by Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe. Grant Wiggins, he's passed away now, but Jay McTighe is still super active. I don't think he's that old. I don't know how old he is, but he's on Twitter 6 times a day, so he's definitely got use of his thumbs, right? Or do we still use thumbs? Yeah, we do use thumbs on it. Anyways, that's beside the point. So their approach to planning, so Lynn Erickson's approach to planning, the main focus is conceptual understanding. The Wiggins and McTighe UBD planner, it starts from, its end goal is the performance or the skill that you want students to have at the end of the unit. So it's basically pretty simple. We sometimes call it backwards by design, and it means if this is the objective that I'm teaching to, this is the indicator that says the objective has been taught. So the place that you start is, what do I have to do to get that particular performance happening in my students? And it's a much simpler plan. It's hugely popular in the US. I've been to schools where they use this planner and they don't even know, they've never heard of Wiggins McTighe, but this is the planning format that they use, and they're not really sure why, because it is so pervasive. There's an electronic planning system called Atlas Rubicon. Does anybody use Atlas Rubicon? Any hands? Atlas Rubicon is a big American curriculum mapping software, and that was their default planner. So I think that's what happened, was just because the planning system turned on and that was the planner that was there, people started using it without actually understanding. It's a pretty pretty simple idea. And this book has been translated into several different languages, and it doesn't take very long to read. It's quite thick, but most of it is kind of case studies, so you can kind of skip the case studies and just read the kind of important bits. That's the same with Lynn Erickson's books. Some of them are kind of thick, but it doesn't take very long to read them because you can kind of, cause there's a lot of examples of Johnny was a student in a math class, blah, 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 blah. You don't necessarily have to read that stuff. So there's 2 versions of this planner, and you can access it. It's one great thing about it, it's free, right? If you go to McTighe and Associates website, I think these links will take you directly to the actual files. So their planning format's free to use, so you just basically click on it, download it, and away you go. And as you can tell, this is the first version of it, and I think it's still in use in some schools. Again, quite often because it was put into their planning database thing, so it was too hard to change. But it starts with the top is established goals, understandings that you hope for kids to have, right? Essential questions that you want students to investigate. And this, just like the Erickson planner, she divides it into understanding, doing, and knowing, right? Basically, she has like 3 kind of skills or performances that you want kids to develop, and teachers actually, Erickson planners can get very complicated because they actually ask you to map these things. So you'll see, if you see a completed one, they'll have all these U1, K2 little dots and notations in the margin. It's to keep track of these things. This one's a little simpler, and there's really very few rules about it. One of these links here, the ones that say standards, if you go to their website, another really great thing about the UBD planner is it's fairly simple, right? And it comes with standards that are published by McTighe and Associates that say this is kind of what a good one should look like. Because I know that in the IB community, and I've done hundreds and hundreds of school visits, quite often IB teachers, when they want to share, if you're in a physical meeting with them, when they want to share their planners, they'll quite often kind of push them across the table to you. They quite often don't hand the document to them. They kind of push it like this. And to me, that's a sign that they're really unsure that they've worked really hard on this document, but they're really unclear as to whether or not it's a good one, right? Because in the IB world, the kind of, it's better now than it used to be, but in the old days, there was no kind of standards that said this is what it's supposed to look like. Now they have more information, so I think people are a little more comfortable about actually working with these documents. But the great thing about the UBD planner is there's these standards, they're fairly simple, and it just kind of says this is a good one. This one needs some more work. Excuse me. This is version 2, and version 2, obviously, I think it's a little bit better, and it's what changed is that they kind of added this transfer, meaning, and acquisition sections, right? Students will know, students will be skilled at, still has understanding, still has essential questions, but this is a really big one. So that's not in the previous version. So in the previous version, oops, sorry, I pressed the wrong button. Where did I go? 1 sec, sorry. I just pressed the wrong button. The previous version, this acquisition understanding part isn't actually there. So in this version, it is there, right? And I think, right. And it's basically divided into 3 stages, right? So desired results, evidence, the performance evidence that you're looking for, and the last part is the learning plan. The learning plan would be the more kind of traditional, more traditional kind of, in UBD planners, quite often it does look like lessons, right? But in IB planners, it doesn't usually. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about inquiry-based units. So again, there are many different unit planning formats for inquiry-based units. Generally, I think they follow an inquiry cycle, and there are also many different. We've got several people who've already said here, I plan units as inquiries. I'm aware. Oh, I'm aware. So, lots of people. Everybody plans inquiries, right? So, just is that because you're all IB teachers, or are you planning inquiries into? Okay, we got a lot of IB teachers, yeah. So they do plan. They're supposed to be planning inquiries. Hopefully, if everything's working right. Every once in a while, it's a little hard to tell, but that's what they're meant to be doing. But generally, they follow some kind of inquiry cycle, and there's a lot of inquiry cycles out there. A really popular one with IB schools, especially PYP schools, is the work of Kath Murdoch. Is anybody here, show of hands, anybody heard of Kath Murdoch? Right, you know that I've heard her speak before, and she considers herself kind of the Robert Oppenheimer of inquiry, because what she has this kind of complicated inquiry sequence. It's got several different stages in it, and what she's unhappy about is that people took that planner to be kind of a recipe for inquiry. So if you do this, you end up with an inquiry. And I've been in schools and heard teachers having arguments that this isn't tuning in. We've already moved behind. Like, they've created all these artificial rules about where the divisions between these lines should happen. And she's not very happy about that. She sort of says that it should be a much more organic process. It shouldn't be so do this, do that, do this, do that around the cycle, right? There should be more thought to it than just following the cycle. Just wanted to talk a little bit about forms of inquiry. So inquiry units, I think the unit planning for them kind of depends on what kind of level of inquiry you're talking about. So this isn't the only taxonomy of inquiry by any means, but it's one. I like the picture. I like the pool, so that's why I use it. But these terms, so different people have different terms for this. The first one, structured inquiry, controlled inquiry, guided inquiry, and free inquiry. And when I talk about this with my students, previously they were mostly Japanese, there was this kind of strange thing that they thought that open inquiry is the best, right? And we should always be striving for open inquiry. But each one of these different types of inquiry serves a different purpose and a different audience, right? And one's not better than the other. It's just that they come in different levels of teacher regulation. So especially you'll notice this when schools that are new to, like, for example, the IB primary years program, when they design inquiries, quite often they're very structured inquiries. So the teacher's not completely comfortable with it yet, and they still want to have some control over it. So they are the ones controlling kind of the process and when everybody moves between the different things. Controlled inquiries, a little less so. Guided inquiries are where basically a teacher chooses topics and questions and students design a product or solution. So this is a bit much more kind of freer version of inquiry. Free inquiry, students choose topics without any reference to a prescribed outcome. So in the IB world, none of the inquiries, including the formal ones like the extended essay, the personal project, the community project, none of them get close to free inquiry. They would be somewhere between controlled and guided, because we require that the evidence that they inquired has a certain kind of format so that it can be interpreted by others, right? So none of the inquiry in the IB gets even close to free inquiry. But
Curtis, I'm sorry, I had a question with regard to inquiry. I just wanted to know, like, what about in the DP when they are doing their extended essays or their IAs in different subjects? would that classify as free inquiry? Because they choose their own topics, what they want to research and study about and present papers on them. So would that be free
Well,
inquiry?
technically not, no, because we mark those, right? And because we mark those, the assessment criteria dictates the format. It dictates the process that they have to undergo, and it dictates the final product, right? Even the MYP personal project, right?
Right.
Although the student is free to choose whatever they want to, right? In order for us to mark it, we have to impose a process and we have to impose a format. There's choice within that, right? The PYP exhibition probably gets more, that's probably closer to not free inquiry, because there's still a requirement that there's some kind of presentation or something, but the PYP exhibition is the one where the teacher has the most freedom to structure it. But I think the teachers, because they tend to structure the inquiry, it's still not quite free inquiry, right? Because it's not free inquiry is more like when you want to learn how to make a new, when you want to learn how to make, technically, free inquiry is like when you want to learn to make a new dish and you hit YouTube and start hunting, right? Because there's no requirement of a product and there's no requirement of process, right?
Okay. So does that mean, does this picture also indicate that, you see like a gradual drop in the kinds of inquiry? I mean, like, so I just wanted to understand whether this picture depicts that free inquiry is the least, I mean, the one that's least used, and
I think
structured is maximally used or more
well,
commonly.
I think in school, free inquiry isn't used very often, right?
Right.
Sometimes there's things like Genius Hour and stuff like that that kind of are close to it, but they still have some kind of structure. But the even at the what I discovered when I started working at graduate school, a master's thesis is the least of the free forms of inquiry, because basically to pass your thesis it has to be it has to be in 5 parts, it has to be 15,000 words, it has to be da, 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 da. Do you know what I mean? Like there's you have freedom over the topic, but you don't have freedom of the process. I mean, you do have freedom over what research process you decide to use, but basically it's still not a free inquiry. I think free inquiry is like, if we're hoping to create lifelong learners, right? We've given them the skills that they can structure their own inquiries for their own purposes in the
Okay.
future.
Okay.
Would
Right.
be my take on it. Yeah,
Okay. Yeah.
but
Thank you.
there but when you show this to students, they always think free inquiry is the only one that they should be aiming for. But as I mentioned before, they all have different purposes. Like science is all about inquiry, but usually experiments follow a very specific
Structure. Yeah.
structure. Otherwise, it's not an experiment anymore, right? It's
Right.
it's it's something else. It's
The
more like
lab experiment gone wrong. True.
exactly something bad happens to the lab, right? And I just thought I just wanted to have a go at this if you're able to do this. Um, uh, yeah, I think we have too many people. I think we have too many people to yeah we have too many people to break into to breakout rooms here. So just those of you that are able to draw on this slide, I wondered if you could just roughly sketch out what you see as an inquiry cycle. And I'm going to turn my head off for just 1 sec because I just need to move for a sec. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to start designing an inquiry cycle. Don't look it up on Google. Just like, well, you can if you want to, actually. It's okay if you looked it up on Google. But just kind of, it doesn't, there's no right answer here, right? Oh, Gayan, how are you? I see Gayan's with us today. She's also in Japan, a little further down the island. And I just had to get up because it's cold here and I had to close my doors because my heat was escaping. Hi, Gayan.
Hi, Curtis.
How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, it's getting cold.
I heard you just became a PYP coordinator.
Yes.
Ah, so that means you're no longer the longest serving MYP coordinator on the planet.
No, unfortunately, but I still have to work with our MIP and DP. So
Ah, I see. But Haya, yours is you're going for a three stager, and I can see that. I can see that. Pete, you're pretty good with that little mouse and drawing. Yours is looking lovely. Okay, we won't spend too much time on this, but I think we should be able to see. Can you see the responses? Let's see.
Curtis, is this a drawing function?
Yeah.
So for drawings, we are still updating. So you'll be able to show responses for participants if they do text type of questions or multiple choice. Maybe we'll just use draw it function later. Maybe in a couple of weeks, this will be updated.
Okay, but I can see your drawings on my screen, and you can actually, if you're looking at my screen, but I can't make them bigger.
I think Curtis, you can click on that image. Yeah, just select one, click on it. Please click on that. Yeah. I
Oh,
think it should pop up.
I'm clicking, but it.
Oh.
Oh, it does. It pops up on. I see. So when I click on it, oh no, you're still not showing it. It's kind of showing
so
it, but
you
not
can
showing
show
it. Sorry about
responses.
that, folks.
Yeah, you have to
But
show
I can see Krishna. She's got tuning in, finding out, sorting out, going further. Yeah, so that's very close to the cat.
Cat mode also.
Yeah, exactly.
Dog inquiry cycle.
Priya's got identified need, investigate, research, design, create, analyze, and evaluate. There's 5 parts to that cycle. That looks really nice, right? And Gayan's got Gayan, because she's an MYP person. She's got she's got investigator. It's too small to read. I think it's inquire, act, and reflect. I'm also a die in the wool MYP person, and the MYP chose a very simple inquiry cycle with just those 3 stages. And I think it's kind of I personally like inquiry cycles that are a little simpler, just because I think they're easier to work with. When you get them too many stages, then it gets to be kind of cookbooky, in my opinion. Oh, got present, topic, respond, discuss, inquire, question. Ronald, thank you. Yeah. And I think that's a good point too about inquiry cycles. So the one that Ronald put here, proposed topic, respond, discuss, inquire, that's one that wouldn't have to be like a whole 6-week unit. That could happen in a much smaller space of time, I think, right? That's kind of cool. Investigate, act, reflect, inquiry, action, and reflection. Right. So basically, a common part to that is a common part is definitely the reflection part and the action part. Great. Okay, I'm just going to show you these are IB planners. The first one is an MYP planner, and it starts at its first stage is inquiry, right? Which, because it's following that 3-stage kind of inquiry cycle, and it's actually for people, for IB teachers here, what the IB did was they hired Lynn Erickson, and they hired Wiggins and McTighe. I think Wiggins was still alive then, or maybe just McTighe. I can't really remember that part. But they hired them to consult on the development of the MYP planner. And what they did was they took pieces of both of those people's work and they kind of put them together. And unfortunately, when they did it, they didn't keep the same words because of intellectual property rights, I think was the reason. And so they kind of created their own words, which caused problems because, well, some of the words should be different because they have specific purposes in the IB world, but at the same time, it's created a lot of confusion. And I think that unless teachers go back and they look at Erickson's work and they look at you understanding by design, when they come back to the IB planner, it makes a lot more sense. I was an IB teacher for like 18 years, and I was particularly good at filling these things out. But it wasn't until I started teaching university and I went back and I read all this stuff that I was supposed to have read before that I didn't. Right after reading all that stuff, it was like, oh, that's why I'm doing this. That's why they're asking me to do this. Ah, that's what this is supposed to be in the planner. Really, I had dutifully filled them out and I was a pretty good IB teacher, I think, right? But I hadn't really thought about what was behind it. I just kind of mechanically did it. And so I think it's really important if you're in charge of administrating staff and you want them to move to these type of planners, go back and look at the actual work that they were built upon, because it just is all of a sudden light bulbs go ping, 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 ping. That's why I'm supposed to be doing this. So this planner's got, it's the IB plan, the MYP planner is kind of a cross between an Erickson planner and a UBD planner, because it's got dual purposes here, right? So the top we have what we call key and related contexts or concepts. We have something called a global context. Teachers write a statement of inquiry, which kind of defines what the purpose of the unit is, sort of. They have some inquiry questions. Down here we have the IB objectives they have to add, and very high up in the process is the creation of a summative assessment. The summative assessment isn't at the top, right? Because it's sort of serving a dual purpose, right? The purpose of the summative assessment is for students to demonstrate their conceptual understanding. That's implied in planner, but in a UBD planner, the assessment is at the top rather than kind of sharing the space. And in an Erickson planner, the concepts are at the top and assessment is further down. But in the IB world, we kind of want the two things to happen at the same time. This planner's been around for quite a long time. It'll be interesting to see what happens. I know that Gayan, you're also on the MYP revision group that's talking about the revisions.
Enhancing. Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you look at the comments coming, they have it's actually a really diverse group. Must be about 200 people commenting on this thing, and they do come from all over, everywhere except Japan. Oh, except they've got you, Gan, but not. I don't think it has any Japanese on. But at any rate, a lot of the comments are coming through are talking about the kind of prescriptive nature of the MYP planner and some of the IB rules that are too prescriptive. And I think the next version of the MYP, you're going to see some of those rules relax a lot more, which is kind of good. If you're an old school person, we kind of clung to those rules because we'd mastered them, right? I know how to do it. So if they change it, it's going to mess me up. But I think that the relaxing, I'm sure that in the PYP community, when they said you don't have to use the bubble planner anymore, I'm sure a lot of people were like, right? But I'm sure it'll work out in the end. And then next one I want to take a look at here is the PYP planner. The PYP planner, this is the new PYP planner, which I think this is a really cool unit planner, but it wreaks havoc on electronic databases because it's a circle, right? And it's hard to design a system that will input this text into another. But if looking at this planner, it doesn't see that the MYP planner is very linear, right? So it's start here, work down, right? Because it's on a piece of paper and it's kind of shaped that way. The other thing that's really interesting that is something to do with our brains is the size of the box sort of says what's most important, but really it was just a word table, and the boxes can grow and shrink. They don't actually denote like importance, right? It's just kind of the structure of the form. But the structure of the form does have big effects on how people deal with it. So in this PYP planner here, it's kind of interesting because if you ask people and the question was, how does this planner look different from the ones you've used before. Somebody said it looks a lot different, right? Or actually, Toral, I'm pronouncing your name wrong. She said more. Do you mean more like more fields than you're used to, or that might be what the intent was? But what's interesting when you look at this, kind of, it sort of suggests where you should start planning, right? It kind of looks like you should start with the middle and work out, but at the same time, it doesn't say you can't start at the outside and work into the center, right? So it's kind of interesting, and I think it depends a lot on which beautiful thing about this one is that it depends a lot on your school's culture, right? Because if your school has a very prescriptive curriculum, you're not going to start with a central idea. You're going to start with the learning goals, right? Because that's where you naturally are going to start. If your school is like a big conceptual school, you're probably going to start with the concepts. So you could start kind of wherever you wanted to and either work your way out from a central idea, which I think most people don't do. I think the central idea happens after they've kind of got the rest of it figured out, but it can work from both different directions, which I think is kind of interesting. And this is somebody mentioned here, I've used this, but I find it difficult. Oh, somebody said, I've used this, but I find it difficult. June, why do you find it difficult? Difficult to...
Yeah, so I'm here. Difficult in the sense, to align all my ideas and things. It's usually a collaborative meeting that we have. It's just not one teacher doing it. So, everybody's ideas, we are jotting it down, we're writing it inside this. Like technically, we have to take a print. Okay, we write it up, fill it up. But on a digital media, it is very difficult. So what we have done is the same things according to the numbers. We have put them in the Word format. The content is the same. So we have arranged it in a sequential format where we can fill in all the stages of the inquiry.
Okay, the old PYP planner I was looking at the other day, and it actually had numbers on it. So it was like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and that numbers meant obviously you're not going to start at 9, right? I mean, you could, you don't have to follow anybody's rules. If you want to start at 9, you can. But it was much more linear. And this one, and like June mentioned, it could be a little more difficult to like organize your ideas just by looking at like this. But it's an interesting planner, and I'm kind of glad that the IB came up with it. Okay, so those are the types of planners I wanted to share with you, and I realized we got about 15 minutes left or so. But I did want to talk a little bit about this context idea. So, and I think you can answer this question as a text response, and you might not be able to see. I think you can see the responses if I share on my screen. But big question, what do we mean by learning and teaching in context? Because that's something about a difference between unit plans and lesson plans. I think it's harder to put a lesson into context because it's too small, but a unit plan theoretically, because it's a much more sophisticated thing, we should be able to first answer, and I'll show. I think if I show responses now on this screen, yeah, bingo. Pacing what we want students to understand. Real world situation, events or circumstance. Yeah. So this is interesting, this term real world, because school isn't the real world, right? And no matter what you do, it's never going to be the real world. Well, I guess to little kids, it's kind of really their world, but as you move up the lines, connections to real world scenarios. I think that's pretty fair. Does anybody else want it? That's a great word. Authentic to students. Yeah. Because I think for learning to really work well, it needs to have definitely some connection to the student's life before they consider it relevant and meaningful. And quite often we use that term authentic, right? Same problem, data which can be used to teach different objectives, concrete real life situation that's presented to students.
Situation. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Now, in the IB programs, the PYP and the MYP, and to some extent the DP, the contexts that we teach in are prescribed. So in the PYP, they have the transdisciplinary themes, right? And in the MYP, we have these things called global contexts. So they're actually prescribed, and teachers have to use them. What I've noticed a lot in schools that aren't IB schools is that they're using the SDGs. What's SDG? SGD? No, GD. Sorry.
Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 of them. Yeah.
Yeah, they're using the 17, right, which is kind of interesting because they're very noble and wonderful, right? But there are 17 of them, right? So it is a little bit hard to kind of squeeze them in. But schools can use different contexts, and something that's a feature of unit planning is that your unit should have some kind of context. Using students' environments where they live, make connections, presenting information in a way that makes it relatable. Yeah, all great answers. Thank you for those contributions. Contextual, I did some kind of, had to do some back reading from some classes I was teaching. Contextual learning, when it was a thing in the literature, was kind of back in the early 80s, right? And these guys here were kind of some of their proponents. So, and I think contextual teaching and learning is a conception of teaching and learning that helps teachers relate subject matter content to real-world situations and motivate students to make connections between knowledge and the applications in their lives, family, and later work. And they're suggesting there's a couple of different ways to do it, which are pretty popular. Problem-based learning, project-based learning isn't here, but it probably should be. Cooperative learning, service-based learning, and work-based learning are all kind of contexts we can use to help make teaching a little bit more relatable. Another question for you, and I think this is another Mentimeter, right, is besides the examples that were given on the previous screen, what other examples could you give to help bolster authenticity in a unit? So other things that could be used. Let's see here. Present. Let's see if we see context for learning. Other things that could be used for context for learning. Ooh, thank you. Yeah, history, news, social aspects, social problems. What else have we got? The global context, that's an MYP thing. Oh, field trips. Excellent example. Field trips could definitely be something that helps add to a context. Recent news. Yeah, I think that's been used for a long time. Current events, kind of in social class, right? History, news, empathy mapping, guest speaker sessions, social media, design problems. Yeah, I think design problems are, and they don't have to be just physical design problems. They could be like social community service type problems, and that's being used quite a bit now. If anybody's looked at the MYP, the recent changes to the interdisciplinary guide, they've actually made that changes. They've made that a function of an interdisciplinary unit, which is so good because before they could go off track quite easily. So ATL skills, yeah, recent news events, history, great, thanks. Thank you for bringing that up. Somebody brought up GRASPs, which is always hard to type because I think it's capital G period, capital R period, right? It's a lot of typing. But if you're not sure what GRASPs is, we won't talk about it today too much, but it's a UBD strategy for kind of assessing the authenticity of your unit or assessment. And if you just type GRASPs into the internet, it pops up. And on that Wakelet, I think I added a few things about GRASP. This is interesting because I don't know what happened, but somewhere in the IB workshop world, people were showing it as an example, and a lot of IB teachers think it's a mandatory IB thing, but it's not a mandatory IB thing. It comes from UBD. ATL skills to you. Okay. Oops. Did I just do something bad? No, I didn't. Right. Thank you for sharing that. Okay. Just another couple of points from an administrator's view about the importance of unit plans. It allows for collaboration and review, right? Because if you were just dealing with a collection of unit plans or lesson plans, not so easy to review. And electronic mapping systems make it so much easier than it was before, right? Because it used to be that stuff was on paper and files and all sorts of stuff. People would lose the filing cabinet and poof, it was all gone, right? But there's so much you can do today with like electronic mapping systems, and some of them are really collaborative, which is really great. And communicating the curriculum. This is a picture of a POI, which is a program of inquiry. PYP schools, this is something that when you walk into the building, you see this thing, and kids walk past it every day. And usually what it is a list of the units from kindergarten all the way to grade 6 or whatever years the program runs, with kind of the high points of it. So parents know what's coming up in the next year, students know what's coming up in the next year. It's a super important, super wonderful way of sharing the curriculum. There's all sorts of different ways you can do it. Physical displays, curriculum walls, handbooks, websites, electronic mapping systems like ManageBack. Right, it's huge that parents have access to that, and it kind of increases transparency, and it helps build a more coherent learning experience because everybody kind of knows what's going to happen. Before, I think kids don't necessarily make connections between what came before and what came after, and communicating the curriculum like this allows us to make those connections and makes learning a little bit less random for students. And I was going to get you to do this, but I'm not, because I'm going to move on to just give you a quick overview of the Classcipe, and Yanan might be able to help me out here if you have any technical questions about it, because I'm not an expert at it yet. But basically, through this Classcipe system, they have a planning tool that's a little bit different than some of the other ones, and we're taking a look at. They've got built into the system already. They've got kind of a default unit plan, which is kind of talking about some of the things we talked about before, but just not in a specific order necessarily. They have IB unit plan format built into it and a Cambridge format built into it. What I think is really kind of cool though is, and I think unique because none of the other ones. It used to be a long time ago when ManageBack first started, and then they had a few number of schools. If you put in a request for an addition or something, they could sometimes handle it. But I think those days are long gone, right? Because they're no longer kind of adjustable, adaptable. But this system is. So it doesn't matter what planning approach that you choose, right? You're able to add fields, subtract fields, kind of create your own. And as far as I know, that's not you could either do it as an individual teacher if you're just using it for you, or if you were a school, you could set that up so it was a school-wide adjustment to the planner, which means and this is probably more important for IB schools now than it used to be, because the PYP planner is no longer prescribed in the processes, but you don't have to use that per forma anymore. Oops. Right. And this is just an example of a piece I took out of somebody's. This one's obviously following must be an IB type of unit by the looks of it, observation. But from what it's a MYP unit, because they've got factual, debatable, and conceptual. They had debatable, but I chopped them off. Questions. And the other thing that the planning tool lets you do is it lets you attach assignments and all sorts of stuff to it, which is pretty useful because it's all in one space. Great. And I think that's All I had to say, I'm just about a little bit early, so we could open up to a couple of questions if you like.
Yes. So here, everyone, if you have some questions, you can open your camera and speak to Curtis directly. And afterwards, I would encourage you to put your feedback on the chat box about how do you think today's Curtis session is. And together with your feedback, please put what is your name, and if you hope any other information you want to introduce to others, or just the feedback is okay. Yeah. Oh, I see someone has a question.
Hello. Yeah. I got a question. Like I've heard that the free inquiry like cannot be extended essay or internal assessments. But just so what I am given to understand that free inquiry cannot be something which is assessed or which is criteria based.
Well, in those people, I mean that chart that I showed you, right? That's for some reason, right? People felt a need to like classify different levels of inquiry, but it's not any kind of rule or anything like that. It's just that's how they decided to show that inquiry can move from quite structured, like do this, do that, do this, do that, teacher leading them through, right up to just like how you or I would open inquiry in that categorization is how you or I as adults would decide we want to learn something new. So there's no dictated process, no dictated product, right? So it's not that the extended essay, it is definitely a sophisticated and very interesting inquiry, but at which the student has a lot of choice. They have most choice about the topic. They have less choice about the formats, especially the internal assessments. If you decide to get completely creative with a math internal assessment, it's probably not a good time to take those risks, right? And just like a personal project, although they have a lot of agency in how they choose their process, we still have to grade it. So therefore, the grading kind of imposes a process and more often than not an actual format for the product, whereas open inquiry wouldn't. How you would mark an open inquiry, God knows. Like I don't think you could, right? Because maybe you wouldn't want to, you wouldn't need to.
I'm just asking a kind of a question which is actually not from sciences. I won't be asking a man of science. For example, if I say list out investigate a factor that affect the global economy of USA or say India between this to this. So obviously there are n number of factors which can affect, and suppose there are 5 learners in my class and all of them are studying different factors. So obviously their approach can be different. So can't it be still considered as a free inquiry that's criteria based and may not be marked? Maybe it is just a formative assessment.
Oh yeah, exactly. That would be it. You know, a good example of kind of a free inquiry would be something like science fair, right? Because science fair is like, it doesn't have to take, sometimes they kind of make them put up some thingies, right? But that's the only kind of requirement. The kids in total charge of the topic they want to choose and the process they want to take and how they want to present it, right? But again, in terms of the diploma, right, we have to grade the inquiries, right? So they do have to be a little bit more structured, right? But hopefully there's still a lot of agency on behalf of the student in what they choose and how they approach it, maybe, and things like that. There's definitely a lot of agency. But when they mention open inquiry, right, and different authors talk about it differently, right? There's no one version of it, but generally it doesn't have a prescribed process, it doesn't have a prescribed product, and it doesn't have a prescribed topic, right?
I think we only have time for one more question. And for other people, you can choose to maybe leave a comment in the chat box. And if after the meeting, you can try to post your question on Classcipe Facebook page or Facebook group, and I will help you to deliver those questions to Curtis, and if he wish, he can reply you on the post you make on Classcipe Educators Community. Yes. So only one more question. Ronaldo, I think Ronaldo is the second person to raise up the hand. Sorry.
Okay. Yes, he had the question also in the chat box.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for giving the time. So I have one question. So Curtis, in your experience as a IB teacher, I don't know what subject you specifically teach, but in your experience, what is the best way to develop a unit plan, especially for design? Are you like coming up with the product outcome first and then you're working backwards, or you are choosing like key concept first, related concept, and form that out into, and you can figure out what the output will be later?
Oh, so my main subject was MYP design, and the diploma subject I teach, I can't remember the initials, information in global society, something, right? But I was a design teacher. So, and you're asking where would be my starting point? Well, sometimes it's resource based, right? Because these are the resources I have, right? And in some different schools I worked at, we had different resources, but like I taught it mainly through computer stuff. So I would go on the software we had. So basically I knew that I had to do a desktop publishing thing, and I had like 5 or 6 things I could do. So that's kind of where I would start. So, and then you would kind of not add the rest on, but depending on which concept worked best with that particular design product you were going to work with, that's how I usually kind of did it. But it was I would have started with resources, right? What I actually had to write. And I think the same could be said of like even language and literature teachers, right? For you don't have an infinite choice of class sets of novels, right? You might only have 5 of them for your grade level, right? So you start with what your resources, and you kind of build the unit around the resources that you have. Not always, but I think often. Or curricular content. I remember the first time when I taught my first years, I was teaching IGCSE and MYP design at the same time. So the IGC curriculum dictated what units I could have, basically, right? So I had to start from curriculum there, right? I think the starting point can be different. I think there's very few people that could start from a concept, right? Because that would mean you weren't accountable to a curriculum at all, right? Right. So I think resources and curriculum would be kind of the starting points for me. And then in the MYP world, the next kind of restriction would be the objectives, because you have to do X number of objectives each term. So it's kind of a puzzle, putting all the pieces together, right? And I don't know if there's like a better place to start than another place. I think it really depends on your school's context. And I don't think there's a wrong starting point and a right starting point.
Okay, thank you so much for the answer.
Sorry. Yes. So other people, if you have questions, please post it in Classcipe Facebook page, and I will invite Curtis to have a look at it when he's free, and maybe select certain questions to answer. So now let me make a few important announcements. First of all, I thank Curtis for giving us this wonderful, amazing 90 minutes workshop in the weekend. And guys, please leave your feedback here in the chat box. How did you experience this workshop? Do you like it or not? And second, we are going to have a second free workshop next weekend. It will be delivered by Gurpreet Hanspal. And so how will you be able to register for it? If you can see my screen. I believe that every one of you here has a Classcipe account as already. So when you go into your main page, choose workshop to attend and go to the featured tab. So her workshop, Gurpreet's workshop, is not listed here yet, but I will list it here next week. Then you can simply click register. After you register, it will be shown in your scheduled one. On the workshop day, on the time, the workshop will be listed here in your scheduled, and you can simply enter workshop from here. Yes. And the last but not least, I want to announce a news that we are looking for educator partners around the globe. So currently, this PD workshop platform is only opened for internal Classcipe team to use. But next year, January, we are going to be open it for external users, amazing educators like you. I see Eliana, she has been a facilitator for us before. I believe she can deliver outstanding workshops. So if you register as an educator partner, Classcipe platform will support you to grow on our platform as an influencer. We will help to promote your workshop or teaching content that you can publish on the website and earn extra money. So let me share the registration link for the educator partners. And if you like to know more about it, you can register for it. And we have an orientation for this project next weekend.